When Rowena Ashby signed her name on a dollar bill and handed it to her own sister-in-law across a courthouse parking lot, she was not buying a building. She was buying the right to be looked at that way, with that particular expression Celeste Pryor wore, the one that said she had done something generous, when what she had actually done was find a more elegant way to watch someone suffer. The store had been sitting empty for 4 years, its windows filmed with dust, its sign half fallen, its floors warped from a roof that had let water in 2 winters running. And Celeste had handed it over for $1, because $1 was the price of a lesson, the kind you give someone to remind them where they stand. What Celeste did not account for, what nobody in Dunmore Falls, West Virginia could have predicted, was that Rowena Ashby was precisely the wrong woman to humiliate with a building. Because in 6 months, that building would have a line out the door, a name known 3 counties over, and a story that would leave Celeste staring in newspaper at her kitchen table with an expression that everyone who heard the description understood without needing it explained. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The building on Cutter Street had been called Pryor's General for as long as anyone in Dunmore Falls could remember. It had belonged to Tate's family, passed down from his grandfather, who had opened in 1954, through his father, who had kept it running until arthritis made the early mornings impossible, and then to Tate himself, who had inherited it at 31 with every intention of doing something with it, and had spent the following decade doing nearly nothing. It was Tate's way. He had intentions the way some men have opinions, loudly and at length, with very little follow-through. Rowena had learned this early in the marriage and had spent 12 years quietly compensating for it in ways she had not fully named until she was sitting across from a mediator in a beige office in Charleston, listening to the accounting of what their life together actually amounted to. The store had been closed for 4 years by the time the divorce was finalized. Tate had shut it down after a winter where the roof repairs exceeded what he was willing to spend, and he had said at the time that he would reopen it in the spring, and then said it again the following spring, and then stopped saying it. It sat on Cutter Street, accumulating weather and silence, while Tate moved on to other intentions. Rowena was 44 years old when the marriage ended. She had a 16-year-old daughter named Clover, who had her mother's gray eyes and a seriousness about her that had been there since she was small, and a 10-year-old named Bram, who had Tate's dark hair and absolutely none of his tendency toward inaction. She had a checking account that covered the next 6 weeks, if she was careful. She had a resume with a gap in it that was 11 years wide, the years she had stayed home when the girls were young, the years that had been the right decision made with full agreement, and that now looked on paper like an absence rather than a choice. She had been a bookkeeper before Clover was born. She had worked for a small contracting firm in Charleston, had been good at it, had left it willingly with a plan to return, and the plan had held together right up until it hadn't. She applied for 4 positions in the 3 weeks before the divorce was final. 2 never responded. 1 responded and scheduled a phone interview, and then rescheduled it twice, and then went quiet. 1 called her back and told her politely that they had filled the role internally. She was working on it. She would keep working on it. But working on it did not solve the problem of where she and Clover and Bram were going to be on the 1st of the month, which was 18 days away. Her mother was in a care facility outside Morgantown. Her brother was in Colorado and had 2 kids of his own and a mortgage that gave him no room. Her friends from before the marriage, the ones she had held onto through years of Tate's quiet way of making her feel that her outside life was a kind of subtraction from their inside one, were sympathetic and stretched thin in the way that people in their 40s tend to be, with their own complications filling every available corner. It was Bram who found out about the store. Bram was 10 and paid attention to things with the focused curiosity of someone who finds the world genuinely interesting rather than overwhelming. She had overheard something at school, a teacher mentioning the Pryor building, someone's parents saying it was sitting empty, that it was a shame, that someone ought to do something with it. Bram had filed this away and produced it at dinner 3 days before the move-out date with the directness of someone presenting a solution rather than a suggestion. "Mom," she said, "doesn't the Pryor store belong to Dad's family?" It did. Technically, under the terms of the settlement, It had been excluded from the marital assets because Tate's sister Celeste had filed paperwork 2 years prior establishing it as a family property held in trust, a move that Rowena's attorney had flagged and been unable to fully contest. Celeste Pryor was 51 years old, ran the family's small property management operation out of an office on Main Street, and had made clear through 12 years of holiday dinners and careful silences that she considered Rowena an acceptable inconvenience at best. Rowena called her on a Wednesday evening after the girls were in bed. She had waited until they were asleep because she did not want them in the room while she asked Celeste Pryor for anything. There was a version of the next 18 days in which she did not make this call, and she had looked at that version carefully, and it did not work within the timeline she had. Celeste answered on the third ring with the voice of someone who had seen the name on the screen and taken a moment before picking up. Rowena laid out the situation plainly. No preamble, no appeal for sympathy, just the practical shape of it. She needed somewhere for herself and her daughters to live and operate from while she got back on her feet. The Pryor building had living quarters above the store floor, 2 rooms, and a bathroom that Tate's grandfather had used decades ago. She was asking about availability. There was a pause on the line. A long one, the kind that holds several things the other person has decided not to say yet. The building is available, Celeste said. She named a price. $1. Monthly. She said the way you say something when the number is not the point. When what you are actually communicating is that you have thought about this and have decided that the most precise expression of your feelings is a transaction so small it becomes an insult. $1 a month said, I'm giving you something worthless because that is what you are worth in this situation. It said, come back every month and remind us both of this moment. It said everything Celeste did not say out loud. Rowena understood all of it. She said she would take it. She asked when she could have the key. Celeste said she could meet her Friday in the courthouse parking lot, the same parking lot where the divorce had been finalized. Rowena noted this and said nothing about it. She drove out to Cutter Street the next afternoon alone before she brought the girls. She wanted to see it by herself, to have whatever the first reaction was going to be in a place where it would not land on Clover and Bram. Pryor's General was a 2-story brick building, narrow at the front and deeper than it looked from the street. The brick had darkened unevenly over the years, lighter in the upper sections where the weather had washed it, darker at the base where the ground held moisture. The front windows were intact, but filmed so thoroughly with dust and old condensation that the interior was barely visible through them. The sign above the door, white letters on green, had lost the P and one of the R's from Pryor's, so that it read Yo's Jean A.L. in the particular font of something that had once been proud of itself. The front door had swollen its frame from the moisture and required a shoulder to open properly. Inside, the smell of 4 years of closed air and damp wood, and something that had once been a mouse and was now just a memory. The store floor was wide-planked and warped in 2 places where water had come through the roof and sat. The shelving units along the walls were still there, heavy oak, the kind built to last, dusty and cobwebbed, but structurally solid. The front counter was intact. The back room still had the original shelving and a utility sink that, when Rowena turned the handle, ran brown for 30 seconds and then ran clear. The stairs to the upper floor were narrow and steep and solid. The 2 rooms above were low-ceilinged and close and full of the accumulated dust of vacancy. But the floors held, and the windows looked out over Cutter Street on one side, and a back alley and a stand of oak trees on the other. Rowena stood in the larger of the 2 rooms and looked out at the street below. A hardware store across the way. A woman walking a dog. A truck idling at the corner. Dunmore Falls on a Thursday afternoon going about its business, unaware of her. She stood there for a while. She thought about Bram, who had found the solution by listening to adults talk when they thought she wasn't paying attention. She thought about Clover, who would look at this place and see it accurately and then decide what to say about it, which would be the right thing. She thought about $1 a month and what it was meant to mean. Then she took out her notebook and wrote down what needed to happen first. The list had 14 items. 4 of them could be started that day. She went downstairs and started with those 4. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The house on Aldermore Road had been theirs for 12 years. Rowena knew it the way you know a place you have tended carefully and for a long time. The kitchen window that fogged in cold weather and had to be cracked an inch to clear. The third floorboard in the upstairs hallway that shifted underfoot with a sound like a question. The way the back garden caught the afternoon light in late summer at an angle that made everything in it look slightly more alive than it actually was. She had painted the girls' rooms herself. Clover's room twice. Once a pale sage green when she was 4, once a soft charcoal gray when she was 13, and had very specific opinions about what her walls should say about her. Bram's room she had painted a warm yellow that Bram had picked from a strip of samples of the hardware store with the seriousness of someone making a permanent decision, which at 9 she believed she was. She had put in the raised garden beds along the back fence the spring after they moved in. Tomatoes, herbs, a row of sunflowers that came back each year taller than the last. She had regrouted the bathroom tile the summer Bram turned 6, a project that was supposed to take a weekend and took 3 because the original grout was older than anyone had told her and came out in a way that required a different approach entirely. She had stripped and refinished the banister on the staircase. She had replaced the kitchen faucet when it began to drip, watching a video twice, and then doing it herself because the plumber's estimate was more than she wanted to spend, and she was, as she had told Tate at the time, perfectly capable. She left the garden beds. She left the banister she had spent 2 Saturdays on. She left the kitchen table they had bought at an auction in Lewisburg in 2013, the one with the score marks on the right side that she had always meant to sand down and had grown fond of instead. She left the curtains she had ordered from a catalog one February afternoon when a catalog had been the most pleasant thing in a room. She left nearly everything, because nearly everything had been bought with money from a life that was no longer hers, and because Rowena Ashby was not the kind of woman who took things that were complicated to justify taking. There was a cleanness in leaving that way. She had decided this early and had not changed her mind about it. She was 44. She had 2 daughters and a rolling suitcase and 4 boxes and a laundry basket that held the things that hadn't fit anywhere else. The checking account had enough to cover the last month's utilities on Aldermore Road and not much past that. The divorce had been finalized on a Tuesday. She had been packed by Thursday. Tate had left 7 weeks before the paperwork was done. He had gone the way he did most things, with a period of build-up that he mistook for subtlety and that Rowena had read accurately for what it was weeks before he said anything. He had moved back to his mother's house in Beckley, 40 minutes south, with the ease of someone returning to a place that had always been more comfortable than the one he was leaving. He had taken his tools, his truck, his record collection, and the television from a bedroom. He had left the one in the living room, which Rowena thought was probably not a calculated gesture of generosity, but had been willing to receive as one. He called the girls on Sundays. He had called them 4 times in 7 weeks. Clover tracked this without commenting on it, in the way of a 16-year-old who has already made her assessment and sees no reason to keep revising it aloud. Bram mentioned it once on a Tuesday evening and then did not mention it again, going quiet on the subject in the particular way of a 10-year-old who has learned that some absences are better not examined too closely. Rowena did not spend time thinking about Tate beyond what the logistics required. She had made this decision deliberately. She could not change what he did or did not do. She had been out of paid work for 11 years. This was not a mistake. It had been a choice made when Clover was 5 and Bram was not yet born, and the numbers had been looked at honestly, and the decision had been that her staying home made more sense than the alternative. She had agreed to it. Tate had agreed to it. The plan had been that she would return when Bram was in school full-time, and that the years at home would mean something when she did. The years had meant something. Clover and Bram were the meaning. But the resume did not know how to show that. In the job market in Dunmore Falls in the year, she found herself 44, and starting over was not interested in what resumes could not show. She had applied for 3 positions in the 2 weeks before the divorce was final. She had heard back from one. The phone interview had lasted 11 minutes, and the woman on the other end had been polite in the way that precedes a rejection, which arrived 4 days later in an email that wished her well in her search. She was not done searching. She would not be done. But searching took time, and time was the one thing that kept moving regardless of whether she was ready for it to. Her mother was in a care facility outside Morgantown and could not offer a room. Her brother was in Colorado with his own life pressed to capacity. Her friends, the ones she had maintained through 12 years of a marriage that had a way of making outside friendships feel like a small disloyalty, were warm and present on the phone and had no spare bedrooms that solved the problem of the first of the month. So when Bram came to the dinner table and said, quietly and with the particular confidence of someone who has thought something through, that the old Pryor store on Cutter Street was sitting empty, Rowena had listened. She had listened the way she listened to Bram when Bram had something to say, fully, without interrupting, without redirecting, because Bram at 10 had a way of arriving at things sideways that turned out, more often than not, to be the most direct route. She had not said anything right away. She had finished dinner. She had thought about it while she washed the dishes, while she helped Bram with her reading, while she sat at the small desk in the corner of the bedroom that had been hers and was now just hers. By the time she called Celeste Pryor 2 days later, she had already decided. The call was not a decision. The call was just the next step after the decision, which was the way Rowena had always worked. Decide first, quietly and completely, then act. The courthouse parking lot on Friday morning was half empty. A cold front had come through overnight and left the air with the particular sharp quality of early West Virginia spring, the kind that reminds you winter has not fully conceded yet. Just step back a few feet to watch. Rowena arrived first. She sat in the car for a moment, not because she needed to collect herself, but because she had learned over the past several weeks that small pauses before difficult things were not weakness. They were just good management. Celeste arrived 4 minutes later in a silver sedan that was clean in the way of someone who keeps things clean as a matter of principle. She was wearing a coat that had not been bought on a budget, and carrying a coffee she had not offered to share. She walked across the parking lot with the particular bearing of someone who has decided in advance how this interaction is going to go. Rowena got out of the car and met her at the midpoint. Celeste produced the key from her coat pocket. It was on a plain ring with no tag, which told Rowena that Celeste had thought about this moment enough to remove any identifying information, as if the key itself should not be too easy to use. Rowena opened her wallet. She had the dollar ready, a single bill she had smoothed flat the night before and folded once. She held it out. Celeste took it. She looked at it for a moment the way you look at something when the looking is part of the point. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and held out the key. Rowena took the key. "Thank you for the building," she said. She said it the way she had practiced saying it, plainly and without texture, nothing in her voice that Celeste could take home and examine later for signs of distress. Celeste said she hoped it would suit her needs. She said it the way you say something when you hope the opposite. Rowena nodded and got back in her car. She sat for a moment after Celeste's sedan pulled out of the lot. She looked at the key in her hand. It was an old key, heavy for its size, the kind made when things were built to last. She turned it over once. Then she started the car and drove to get her daughters. Clover looked at it another moment. "We could fix that," she said. Something in Rowena's chest eased. Bram had already gone up the front steps and was pressing her face to the dusty window with both hands cupped around her eyes, reporting what she could see in the interior with the energetic commentary of someone who finds everything interesting. "Mom, there's a counter. Mom, the shelves are still in there. Mom, I can see all the way to the back." They went in together. The door required the shoulder, which Bram attempted first with considerable effort and moderate success, and which Rowena finished. Inside, the smell of closed years and damp wood, and the particular quiet of a space that has not held people for a long time. Bram moved through the store floor with the systematic enthusiasm of an expedition. Clover walked more slowly, running a hand along the oak shelving on the east wall, looking up at the ceiling, crouching to look at the floor where it had warped near the back. She stood up and looked at her mother. "The shelves are solid," she said. "The floor can be fixed. The smell will go when the windows are open." Rowena looked at her older daughter and felt the specific quality of pride that has nothing to do with achievement and everything to do with character. Upstairs, the two rooms were low and close and full of the accumulated quiet of vacancy. Bram picked her room immediately, the smaller one at the back that looked out over the oak trees, on the grounds that the trees would be good to look at in the morning. Clover took the front room, which was slightly larger and looked out over Cutter Street, and stood at the window for a moment looking down at the sidewalk below. "It's a good window," she said, and that was her verdict on the room. That evening, Rowena sat on the floor of the store with her back against the old counter and her notebook open on her knee. The girls were upstairs. The building was quiet around her. Through the front windows, now cracked for the first time in 4 years, a cold thread of air moved through the space, and the smell of it began, slowly, to change. She looked at the shelving, at the wide plank floors, at the front counter, which was solid oak and 8 feet long, at the pressed-in ceiling, intact, at the back room with its utility sink and its original shelving and its single window that let in the last of the afternoon light. She had been a bookkeeper. She understood numbers, how they moved, what they meant, where the margins were. She understood inventory, having managed a household budget for 11 years with the precision of someone who could not afford to be approximate. She understood what people in a small town wanted and did not have, because she had lived in Dunmore Falls for 12 years and shopped its limited options and driven 40 minutes to the next town when those options ran out. Dunmore Falls had a gas station, a pharmacy, a diner that closed at 2 in the afternoon, a hardware store. It did not have a general store, had not had one for 4 years, and the absence of it was something people mentioned the way they mention things that have quietly made their lives smaller. She wrote for an hour. She drew a rough floor plan. She listed what the building had that was usable and what it needed and what the gap between those two things would require. She wrote down 3 things she could do the next morning. Then she closed the notebook and called the girls down for dinner, which was sandwiches eaten on the store floor because the table would not arrive until Tuesday, bought secondhand from a woman 2 streets over for $22. Bram said eating on the floor was better than eating at a table. Clover said that was objectively not true. Bram said it was true for her specifically. Clover considered this and said she would allow it. Rowena looked at her daughters in the dimming light of the old store and thought about the dollar bill and Celeste's expression in the parking lot and the key that was now on the sill upstairs. She thought about what this building was going to become. She did not say this out loud. There was no need to say it out loud. She just thought it. The way you think something when you're certain enough that saying it would only be for the benefit of doubt you do not have. She finished her sandwich and picked up the notebook again. The first morning in the building on Cutter Street, Rowena woke before 5. The room was dark, and the ceiling was close, and for a moment, in the way of first mornings in unfamiliar places, she did not know where she was. Then she did. She lay still for a moment, listening to the building. Old buildings have sounds, the particular language of wood and brick settling and resettling through the night, and Pryor's General had a full vocabulary of them. Creaks from the floor joists, a low sound from somewhere in the walls that was probably the plumbing and was not alarming once she identified it. The particular silence of a street at 5 in the morning in a small town, which is not quite silence, but the absence of the particular noises that come later. She got up. She dressed in the dark so as not to wake the girls. She went downstairs with her notebook and sat at the front counter with a flashlight propped against a jar she had brought from the old house and worked through her list. 14 items, for had been started the day before. She crossed those off and looked at what remained. The roof was the first real question. She had seen the warped floorboards near the back wall and knew what caused them, and a roof that had let water in once would let it in again if left. She needed an assessment before she spent money on floors that might get wet again. She wrote this at the top of the page and underlined it once. The front windows needed cleaning, not replacing. She had looked at them carefully the day before, and the glass was intact. This was one of those things that looked worse than it was, which was a category she had learned to identify quickly because it was the difference between a problem and a situation. Problems required resources. Situations required time and attention, which she had. The electricity was on. Celeste had kept the utilities in minimal service, which Rowena had confirmed before signing anything, and the lights worked in most of the building, except for 2 fixtures on the store floor that needed bulbs and one in the back room that needed a new switch. She added this to the list with an estimated cost that was small. Bram came and looked at the notebook. "Where are all those?" "Things that need to happen," Rowena said. "In order." Bram studied the list with the seriousness she brought to things she found worth studying. "Can I help with any of them?" "The windows," Rowena said. "That one's yours." Bram looked at the front windows, filmed with years of dust and old condensation, and nodded with the gravity of someone accepting a significant assignment. Clover came down at 7:15, dressed, hair done, carrying her school bag. She looked at the notebook on the counter and at her mother and did not ask questions because Clover could read a situation without needing it narrated. She made herself useful instead, finding the cleaning supplies they had brought from the old house and starting on the back room without being asked, working methodically and without commentary in the way she did most things. By 8:30, when the girls left for school, the back room smelled of cleaning solution instead of closed air, and the front windows had been started on her left half. And Rowena had called a roofing contractor whose number she had found in the county directory and left a message that was specific about what she needed assessed and when she needed it done. She stood in the middle of the store floor after the girls had gone. The morning light was coming through the half-cleaned windows in a way that showed the dust still in the air and also the bones of the room beneath it. The pressed tin ceiling, the oak shelving, the wide floors, the long counter. She put her hands flat on the counter and looked at the room. Agnes Murrow knocked on the front door at 9:15. She was 67 years old, retired after 31 years teaching 4th grade at Dunmore Falls Elementary, and she lived 2 doors down in a narrow house with a green door that she had owned since 1987. She was carrying a thermos of coffee and a paper bag that turned out to contain 2 biscuits wrapped in a cloth napkin, and she said she had seen the lights on and wanted to introduce herself to whoever had taken the building. Rowena let her in. Agnes looked around the store floor with the particular expression of someone who remembers what a place used to be. She had shopped here, she said, for years. Everyone had. When Tate's father ran it, there had been lines on Saturday mornings. People came from 2 towns over for the cheese he kept, a local cheddar from a farm up the road that nobody had been able to find since the store closed. She handed Rowena the thermos and the biscuits and looked at the notebook on the counter. "What's the plan?" she asked. Rowena told her. Not everything. The shape of it. What the building could be. What she was working toward. What needed to happen first. Agnes listened without interrupting. When Rowena finished, Agnes was quiet for a moment, looking at the shelving along the east wall. "My neighbor Constance did 30 years as a cook at the county hospital," she said. "She knows more about food sourcing and kitchen setup than anyone I've met. She's been retired 2 years, and she's bored enough to be dangerous." Rowena looked at her. "She'd want to help," Agnes said. "If you'd let her. So would I, for that matter." Rowena thought about this for a moment. She was not accustomed to accepting help without a clear structure around it, without knowing what it cost and what it meant. She had spent 12 years in a marriage where the cost of things was rarely stated up front and had learned from this to be careful. But Agnes was looking at her with the straightforward expression of someone who means exactly what they say and has no secondary agenda, and the biscuits were good, and the coffee was real coffee, and the morning was still early. "I'd be grateful," Rowena said. Agnes nodded, as if this was the sensible conclusion, and refilled Rowena's cup from the thermos. They stood together at the front counter and drank their coffee while the morning light moved through the half-cleaned windows, and the old store held them both in its particular quiet, which was beginning, very slightly, to feel less like vacancy and more like potential. The roof assessment came back on a Wednesday. The contractor, a compact man named Gerald who spoke in the clipped sentences of someone who has looked at a lot of roofs and has stopped being surprised by any of them, walked the perimeter, climbed up twice, and came back down with a number that was smaller than Rowena had feared and larger than she wanted. 2 sections needed patching. The main structure was sound. He could do it the following week if she could put down half up front. She looked at the number for a moment. Then she said yes. This was the first real expenditure, the first time money left her account for the building rather than for survival, and she felt it the way you feel a decision that is right but still costs something. She wrote the check with the deliberate calm of someone making an investment and handed it over before she could revise the feeling into hesitation. Gerald came back the following Tuesday with one other man, and they were done by Thursday afternoon. He showed her the repaired sections from the ladder before he came down. Clean work. She paid the remainder and thanked him and stood in the back room afterward looking at the floor where the warp had been, which was still there, but would now get no worse. She started on the floors the following Saturday. Agnes had found her a floor sander through a man at her church who owned one and rented it for $30 a day, which was considerably less than a hardware store rate. Rowena watched 2 videos the night before, practiced the technique on a small section behind the counter first, and then worked her way from the back of the store toward the front over 2 full Saturdays. Clover helped with the edging, the detail work along the baseboards that the sander could not reach, doing it on hands and knees with a hand sander and a methodical patience she brought to anything requiring precision. Bram's job was sawdust management, which she performed with a shop vacuum borrowed from Gerald and an enthusiasm that consistently exceeded the actual sawdust production. By the second Saturday afternoon, the floors were bare wood. Good wood, as it turned out, wide chestnut planks that had been under the grime for years and had survived it. Constance, who had come by that afternoon with Agnes, stood in the doorway of the store and looked at them with her arms crossed and said simply that she had not known those were under there. Nobody had, Rowena said. They sealed the floors the following week. 3 coats, each one dried fully before the next. The smell of the sealant hung in the building for 4 days, which meant windows open and weather that was still cold enough to make that uncomfortable. But the floors that came out the other side of it were the floors the building had always had underneath everything else, and they changed the room. Constance had opinions about the kitchen setup in the back room, which Rowena had been thinking about as the operational center of whatever the store became. They were useful opinions, the kind that come from 30 years of making a kitchen work under conditions that did not allow for inefficiency. She looked at the space the way Gerald had looked at the roof, with the assessing eye of someone who thinks in terms of function, and told Rowena where the prep area should be, where the storage should go, and why the current position of the utility sink was working against her. Rowena listened and took notes and reorganized the back room over 3 evenings that week. The store was beginning to have a shape. She could see it now when she stood in the middle of the floor in the mornings, the arrangement of things becoming clearer as each piece settled into its right place. The shelving units along the east wall would hold dry goods. The west wall had a long, low ledge that would work for refrigerated display cases when she had the money for them. The counter was the center of everything, the place where transactions happened, where people would stop, where the store would announce itself. She painted on a weekend in late March. She had asked Clover and Bram what color. Clover had said something that didn't look like it was trying too hard. Bram had said green. They had gone to the hardware store together and stood in front of the sample strips for 20 minutes and come out with a color that was neither of the things they had described, but was exactly right, a warm off-white for the walls with the shelving painted a deep forest green that made the oak grain show through in a way that looked deliberate. It took 2 days. By Sunday evening, the store smelled of paint, and the floors caught the last light through the front windows, and the shelving stood clean and waiting along the walls. Bram said it looked like a place that had always been there. Clover looked at it for a long moment. She said it looked like somewhere people would want to come back to. Rowena took a photograph, not to show anyone, just to have. To remember what Saturday had looked like, and what Sunday had looked like after it, and what the distance between those 2 days had cost, and what it had produced. She sent it to no one. She kept it for herself. The permit process took 4 weeks. The county small business office was on the 2nd floor of a building that smelled of old carpet and fluorescent lighting, and the woman who handled Rowena's application was named Patricia. And Patricia was thorough in the specific way of someone who has processed enough applications to know exactly where people cut corners and has decided not to let that happen on her watch. Rowena did not cut corners. She came to every appointment with the paperwork complete and in order, answered every question directly, and scheduled the inspection for the earliest available date. The inspector, a quiet man who wrote everything in a small spiral notebook, walked the building twice and found 2 items that needed addressing before he could sign off. Rowena addressed them within 48 hours and called him back. He signed off on a Thursday. She opened the following Saturday. She had stocked the shelves over the preceding week with the careful logic of someone who had thought hard about what Dunmore Falls actually needed rather than what a general store was supposed to carry. Dry goods, Local preserves from a woman named Bet who farmed 12 miles up the road and had been selling at a farmer's market in the next county because there was nowhere closer to take her product. Fresh eggs from 2 farms she had contacted through Agnes. A rotating selection of baked goods from Constance, who had agreed to supply 4 days a week on terms they had worked out at Rowena's kitchen table over 2 evenings. Coffee, ground fresh, from a roaster in Morgantown who did small wholesale accounts. She had also, after a long conversation with Constance, added a small prepared food section. Soups made fresh each morning. Sandwiches built to order from a short menu written on a chalkboard she had found in the back room and cleaned and hung behind the counter. The idea was not to be a restaurant. The idea was to be the place you stopped when you needed something real in the middle of a day that was moving too fast for a sit-down meal. She unlocked the front door at 8 in the morning. Agnes was there at 8:05, which Rowena suspected was not a coincidence. She bought eggs and a jar of Betty's blackberry preserves and a coffee and stood at the counter for a few minutes talking. And when she left, she held the door for the man coming in behind her who bought soup and a sandwich and said he had heard about the place from his wife, who had heard about it from someone at the pharmacy. By 10 o'clock, 11 people had come through the door. By noon, the soup was gone. Rowena stood behind the counter at 12:15 with an empty pot and a line of people who had arrived too late and felt at her chest the particular feeling of having made something that worked. Not perfectly. She had not made enough soup, but genuinely in a way that mattered. Stellan Marsh appeared on the 3rd Saturday. He was tall, with the particular build of someone who does physical work and has done it for years, broad through the shoulders and unhurried in his movements. He had a smear of wood stain on the back of his left hand that he had not noticed or had noticed and not bothered with. He came through the door at 9:40 with the look of someone who has been working since early morning and has decided that the morning has earned a break. He looked at the chalkboard menu behind the counter with the focused attention of someone actually reading it rather than scanning it. He ordered the soup and a coffee and a sandwich without hesitating, which Rowena had come to recognize as the behavior of someone who knows what they want and does not need to perform the decision. He paid and stood to the side of the counter and ate with the unhurried attention of someone tasting what they are eating. He was not on his phone. He looked out the front window at Cutter Street for a while and then looked around the store with the particular eye of someone assessing a space, noticing its structure. He came back to the counter when he had finished. "This is good soup," he said. "The bread, too. You make it here?" "Constance makes the bread," Rowena said. "The soup is mine." He nodded slowly. "What's in it?" "Whatever looked right at the market on Thursday," she said. He smiled at that. It was a small smile, the kind that arrives without announcement. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after. By the 3rd Saturday, he was arriving early enough to get a seat at the small table Agnes had suggested Rowena put by the front window, which required planning, and which told Rowena something without her needing to name it yet. The Dunmore Falls Spring Market was held on the last Saturday of April, and it ran the full length of Cutter Street from the hardware store down to the old feed barn at the end of the block. It had been running every spring for 31 years, and the town treated it with the particular seriousness reserved for things that have become load-bearing parts of a community's identity. Rowena had been preparing for 2 weeks. She had made 4 times the soup she made on a regular Saturday. She had worked out an arrangement with Constance to supply twice the usual bread and had added 2 new items to the chalkboard: a slow-cooked pulled pork served on Constance's rolls, and a pickled vegetable plate using Betty's preserves, which had become one of the store's quiet bestsellers in the week since opening. Stellan had arrived at 7 that morning, before the market opened, with 2 coffees and no explanation beyond the fact that he had looked at her setup the previous Saturday and had some thoughts about how the serving area could be reorganized to handle higher volume. He had rearranged 3 things in the back room in 40 minutes, and the difference was immediate and structural, the kind of change that makes you wonder how you work the other way. Clover worked the counter with the competence of someone who had been watching the operation long enough to run it without instruction. Bram managed the floor, moving between customers with the natural ease of someone born to make people feel at home, refilling coffee, clearing tables, telling anyone who asked about the soup with the promotional sincerity of a true believer. By 10, the line extended out the front door. By 11, it reached the sidewalk. By 1 in the afternoon, the pulled pork was gone, the soup was rationed, and Rowena was working with the focused automaticity of someone who has passed the point of thinking about the steps and is simply doing them. She looked up once and found Stellan at the far end of the counter, having moved there without being asked, managing the coffee station with the quiet efficiency of someone who solves problems before they become problems. She looked at him for a moment across the busy counter. He caught her eye and said nothing. He just turned back to the coffee. She turned back to the soup. By 3, she was sold out. She stood behind the empty counter and looked at the last of the market crowd moving along Cutter Street, and felt the specific quality of a day that had asked everything of her and had given back more than she had put in. Stellan sat down across the counter on a stool and put a glass of water in front of her. "You're going to need a second person," he said. "Full time." "I know," she said. He looked at her for a moment. His daughters had been at the market that day, had found Clover and Bram by mid-morning, and had spent the afternoon as a unit, the 4 of them managing the floor with a coordination that had required no adult direction. Stellan's older daughter was 15, quiet and observant in a way that reminded Rowena uncomfortably of Clover. His younger daughter was 11 and had Bram's particular gift for making strangers feel immediately comfortable. The Millfield Gazette ran a piece the following Thursday. 3 paragraphs and a photograph taken by a market-goer who had sent it to the paper. The piece named the store, described the line that had extended past 4 other vendors, quoted a longtime market attendee who called it the best thing to happen to Cutter Street in years. The final paragraph noted that Pryor's General was under new operation, that the new owner had plans to expand the prepared food offering, and that a full kitchen permit was pending. Celeste Pryor read the piece on a Friday morning. This was reported by 2 people who had been in positions to observe it, and who felt the information was worth sharing. She had been at her office on Main Street with her coffee and the paper, and the expression she wore when she reached the final paragraph was one that everyone who heard it described understood without needing further detail. The dollar she had handed across a courthouse parking lot had bought something she had not intended to sell. The proposal came on a Sunday morning in early May. The store was closed Sundays. Rowena used the mornings for the work that the open days didn't allow, the ordering, the accounts, the planning that kept the week from becoming reactive. She was at the counter with her notebook when Stellan knocked on the glass of the front door at 8:30 with 2 coffees and the particular expression of someone who has finished thinking about something and has arrived at the part where he says it out loud. She let him in. They sat at the small table by the front window, the one Agnes had suggested, the one Stellan had claimed every Saturday for 2 months. The morning light came through the clean glass and lay across the chestnut floors in long, pale rectangles. He said what he had come to say. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, without theater, without a production of the moment. He had been thinking about it for a while. He thought she knew that. He wanted to know if she would consider building what they were building together in a way that was more than adjacent. Rowena was quiet for a moment, the same way Clover was quiet, taking the information in and holding it before answering. Then she said yes. She said it the way she had made every decision in the past 6 months, with the full weight of having actually thought it through, directly and without performance. The circumstances were not perfect. The kitchen permit was still processing. The accounts were still building toward the number they needed. The second staff member was still theoretical. She said yes because Stella Marsh was a man who had walked into her store on a Saturday morning and eaten soup and come back every week after that, who had rearranged her back room and shown up at 7 in the morning before market day without being asked, who had sat beside her in the empty store after the hardest days and not needed the silence to mean anything other than what it was. She said yes because that evening, when she told her daughters at the table in the upstairs room, Clover smiled the slow, certain smile of someone whose assessment has just been confirmed by the facts. And Bram, immediate and total in her enthusiasm, had 17 consecutive questions, the first of which was whether they were getting a dog. The kitchen permit came through on a Wednesday in June, 6 months and 4 days after Rowena had stood in the courthouse parking lot and handed Celeste Pryor a dollar bill across the cold morning air. Patricia from the county office called to tell her, and Rowena said thank you and hung up and stood behind the counter for a moment with her hand still on the phone. Then she wrote it in her notebook, not because she would forget, because some things deserve to be written down. The store on a regular Saturday morning now looked like this. Constance arriving at 6:30 with bread still warm from her oven at home, letting herself in with the key Rowena had given her 3 weeks after opening. The coffee on by 6:45. Clover downstairs by 7, opening the back room, checking the prep list she had made herself the night before with the organizational instinct she had apparently always had and had simply been waiting for the right context to use. Bram down by 7:15, eating standing up at the counter because sitting down for breakfast felt too slow on a Saturday, asking what needed doing before the door opened. The line started forming at 7:50. By 8:15, when Rowena unlocked the front door, there were usually 6 or 7 people on the sidewalk. By 9, the small table by the window was taken, and the 2 stools at the counter were taken, and the soup was moving steadily, and Constance's bread was down to the last third of the morning supply. Stellan arrived by 9:30 most Saturdays, second or third through the door, with the habit of someone who has stopped pretending the timing is coincidental. He ordered the same thing each week, soup and coffee, and whatever Constance had brought that morning that was different from the week before. He ate at the counter and talked to Rowena when she had a moment and stayed to help with the midday rush without being asked and without making a thing of it. His daughters came most Saturdays now. They had stopped needing introduction to Clover and Bram some time ago and moved through the store with the ease of people who know where things are and what needs doing. The 4 of them had a dynamic that had formed without adult engineering, the specific social architecture that teenagers build when left to determine for themselves whether they like each other, which these 4 had determined they did. Agnes came every Saturday without exception. She bought the same things and stood at the counter for a few minutes and talked and left and came back the following week. Constance supplied 4 days and was thinking about 5. Betty's Preserves had a waiting list now, which Bet found both flattering and stressful, and which Rowena was helping her think through. The second staff member had been hired 3 weeks ago, a young woman named Iris who had just finished her first year of college and was home for the summer and had walked in one Thursday asking if there was work. She had been on time every shift and had learned the prep list in 4 days and had Bram's instinctive ease with customers, which was not a skill Rowena had known how to hire for, but had recognized immediately when she saw it. The full kitchen permit meant the prepared food operation could expand. Rowena had a notebook page that was a plan for what that expansion looked like, rough still but real. Catering inquiries had come in from 2 local businesses and the organizer of the county fair, who had heard about the spring market and wanted to talk. She had talked to both. The conversations had gone the way conversations go when the thing you are offering is something people actually want. She thought sometimes about the dollar bill, about Celeste's expression in the parking lot, the particular quality of satisfaction that had been on her face when she pocketed it, about what that dollar had been intended to say and what it had ended up meaning instead. She had not spent time being angry about it. Anger required attention she did not have and would not have produced anything she wanted. What Celeste had meant as an ending had simply turned out to be an opening, and Rowena had walked through it the way she walked through most things, with her notebook and her list and her daughters beside her and her eyes on what came next. On a Saturday in June, 6 months after the dollar and the key and the courthouse parking lot, Rowena stood behind the counter of Pryor's General and looked at her store. The chestnut floors caught the morning light. The forest green shelving held its inventory in clean rows. The chalkboard behind her listed the day's offerings in Clover's handwriting, which was better than Rowena's and which Clover had taken over without discussion 3 weeks in. The smell of coffee and fresh bread and the particular warm smell of a soup that had been on since 6 in the morning filled the room from the front door to the back wall. The line was 9 deep at 8:20. She asked the first customer what they would like. She already had a reasonable idea. She had been doing this long enough now that she could read most of what people were going to order before they reached the counter, from the way they had been looking at the chalkboard while they waited, from the particular angle of their attention. But she asked anyway, because the person in front of you deserves to be the one who says what they want. Because that small act of asking is the difference between a transaction and something that feels like being known. If you have ever been handed something meant to diminish you and found yourself building something out of it that the person who handed it over never imagined. If you have ever stood in an empty room with a list and a flashlight and 2 daughters and decided that this was enough to begin. If you have ever said yes to something hard and found that yes was the truest thing you had said in years, this story belongs to you. Rowena did not just reopen a store. She rebuilt her life one Saturday at a time, one customer at a time, one notebook page at a time. And the dollar that was meant to mark the floor of how low she had fallen turned out to be the first entry in an accounting that came out entirely differently than Celeste Pryor had intended. Nobody who watched her do it will forget it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.